Hi everyone, and welcome to the first week of our two-module focus on the war on drugs. In this first micro lecture of the module, we're going to look first at the formulation of policy as it relates to the creation of the war on drugs. At this point, we're 50 years into a failed war that has arguably caused more harm than good since its inception. In later micro lectures, we'll discuss the impact the war on drugs has had on incarceration rates in this country and how that has been an extremely costly side effect of legislative efforts to curb drug use and abuse, all while providing minimal treatment resources to people who need them the most. Let's go ahead and get started. Through the course of this semester, I have often alluded to President Nixon's role in the creation of drug policies in this country. While Nixon is typically credited with being the architect of the war on drugs, we know that drug policies had political roots stretching all the way back to the 1920s and 30s. Nixon certainly should get credit with the policies that moved the war on drugs further along in very destructive ways. But he certainly wasn't the first to make a strong push for drug criminalization. Remember, earlier in the semester when we discussed patent medicines and the original regulations that came with opium use on the West Coast, cocaine use in the South, and marijuana use coming across the border. Dating all the way back to 1875, we see the first policies come out regarding opium use. Due to a rise in Chinese immigration through California ports, the city of San Francisco passed their Opium Den Ordinance, which made it a misdemeanor crime to visit places where people used opium. Obviously, they are referring to the opium dens located in primarily Chinese neighborhoods. But with that law, opium use itself was not being outlawed, just visiting the dens. It won't be until 1909 when the federal government passes the Smoking Opium Exclusion Act, which fully outlaws its use. In 1914, Congress passed the Harrison Act, which regulated and taxed the production, importation, and distribution of opiates and cocaine. This law was also very racially biased, as newspaper articles at the time were describing the use of drug by, quote, Negro cocaine fiends and, quote, cocaine-crazed Negroes. Pardon the language, but this was the quotable verbiage printed in 1914. Then, of course, we have the 18th Amendment, which prohibited alcohol manufacture, sale, and use from 1919 through 1933, when it was overturned by the ratification of the 21st Amendment. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, which placed a federal tax on the sale of cannabis and hemp. While the law didn't criminalize the possession or use of marijuana, it included hefty penalties if the taxes weren't paid, including a fine of up to $2,000 and 5 years in prison. So basically what this law did was limit the import of marijuana, basically limiting the availability of the drug due to the tax. This was done largely to target the marijuana coming in from the Mexican border, brought over by immigrants. So we have the third instance in which there is a racial component at play with the language used to craft these bills. It wasn't until 1970 when the passage of the Controlled Substances Act made marijuana use and possession illegal at the federal level. President Richard Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act into law in 1970. It classifies drugs into 5 schedules rated by medical benefits and the level of potential for abuse. The classification ended up relying on fear and stigma rather than on science. This resulted in the seemingly arbitrary scheduling that we see today. There has been very few changes to this law since it went into effect in 1970. Since its inception, critics, even those in his own cabinet, objected to the classification of marijuana as a Schedule I drug. As you may remember from earlier in the semester, the Schedule I drugs have no recognized medicinal value and has a high potential for abuse. Alongside marijuana, drugs like LSD, heroin, MDMA or Molly, mescaline, and peyote, just to name a few. But the marijuana classification has been the biggest issue for many. Alongside the creation of the different drug schedules, we also saw the creation of the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, also known as the Schaefer Commission, who was tasked with studying marijuana abuse in the United States. They wanted to see if Schedule I was the correct classification for marijuana based on what was currently happening with the drug in America. The commission came back and actually went against Nixon's wishes. Instead of classifying it as a Schedule I drug, the commission recommended that marijuana be decriminalized. The commission reported that, quote, the criminal law is too harsh a tool to apply to personal possession, even in the effort to discourage use. It implies an overwhelming indictment of the behavior which we believe is not appropriate. The actual and potential harm of use of the drug is not great enough to justify intrusion by the criminal law into private behavior, a step which our society takes only with the greatest reluctance, end quote. This recommendation was meant to target those users who possessed a small amount of marijuana at the time. They're not talking about the traffickers and the sellers here. In fact, this approach was very similar to the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. Don't criminalize the user, but instead target the sources of the drug. The commission made the recommendation that marijuana be rescheduled in 1972, a recommendation that Nixon completely ignored in favor of the original drug schedule. There have been 14 amendments made to the Controlled Substances Act since its inception, but all of them are working to continuously control and criminalize new drugs that were not available in 1970. While I won't go over all of them here, I do want to point out a few of the bigger additions. For instance, in 1990, we saw anabolic steroids be placed as Schedule III substances. Methamphetamines were added as Schedule I drugs in 1993. In 2000, we saw the date rape drug GHB added as a Schedule I, and a bunch of synthetic drugs added as Schedule Is in 2012. In 2018, newer opioids like fentanyl were added as Schedule II drugs, and some others like OxyContin were moved up to Schedule II from Schedule III. At this point, we have not seen any substances reclassified in a more positive direction. If marijuana were to be taken out of Schedule I, it would be the first drug to be rescheduled more leniently. But in order for that to happen, there needs to be a reclassification in which the medicinal value was recognized by the FDA and the potential for abuse would need to be lowered. So potentially, one of three things could happen. It could be rescheduled as a Schedule II or III, in which a prescription is still needed, as the potential for abuse is still present. Or it could be reclassified as a Schedule V, which is considered an over-the-counter drug where you might need to provide your driver's license to purchase it, much like you would need to do with Sudafed. Alternatively, it could lose all classifications and just be regulated by the state like tobacco or alcohol products, but only time will tell. On June 17th, Nixon gives a press conference in which he declared the war on drugs, stating that drug abuse was, quote, public enemy number one. Remember that in 1971, Our country is still in the midst of the Vietnam War. We're seeing counterculture proliferate throughout the country, and there are strong anti-government feelings at the time. Back in our hallucinogenic lecture, we discussed how much Nixon hated both the hippies and Timothy Leary, who was viewed as the king of counterculture. On Canvas, I have actually posted Nixon's press conference where he declares the war on drugs. When you listen to his speech, he uses strong military terms that are often affiliated with war. He describes his efforts as an offensive against drug use that needs strong strategic coordination. He also makes references to the number of Vietnam veterans who are coming back from the Mekong Delta with addictions to opioids, marijuana, hallucinogens, and other substances. To be fair, there were thousands of returning military members who did return home with substance abuse issues. Vietnam is considered part of the Golden Triangle as it relates to the production and trafficking of certain drugs, primarily heroin. So what he is saying is accurate to an extent, but the way in which he hyped up the so-called war and the enemy created a very stringent atmosphere in which criminalization, not treatment, became the go-to. Nixon asked for $155 million to help combat the addictions for the returning service members, but it missed the mark in trying to help those who needed extensive treatment here at home. Instead, due to the Controlled Substances Act, we saw more folks being arrested for use rather than treatment for the use. Nixon also went on to create the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, in 1973. This agency is a special police force committed to targeting illegal drug use and smuggling in the United States. At the start, the DEA was given 1,470 special agents and a budget of less than $75 million. Today, the agency has nearly 5,000 agents and a budget of $2.03 billion. The creation of this agency went to further criminalize the user, as the DEA was originally tasked with taking down all users and traffickers, something we know as two totally different animals today. After Nixon's resignation, President Gerald Ford maintained Nixon's policies and did not do anything to weaken federal policy as it related to decriminalization. In the 1976 election, Ford continues to remain staunchly anti-drug, where in comparison, his running mate, Jimmy Carter, campaigned on marijuana decriminalization. In 1973, Oregon had become the first state to decriminalize marijuana, so there was already state-level support for this initiative popping up. Carter ran on this campaign promise, and in 1977, just a short 6 months into his presidency, he announced his support to Congress that penalties for cannabis use should not outweigh the actual harms of cannabis consumption. Carter actually kept Nixon's drug policy advisor on staff as he was pro-decriminalization, but appointed his own drug czar, Peter Bourne, to head up the newly formed Office of Drug Abuse Policy. Carter's platform included replacing incarceration with civil fines and the removal of federal penalties for possession of 1 ounce or less of marijuana. Although Carter was in favor of marijuana decriminalization, he was still against the use of harsher drugs like heroin. Carter's efforts were hindered by Bourne, however, when Bourne was forced to resign after he was caught writing a prescription for methaqualones for a staffer in his employ. Bourne was also discovered to have used marijuana and cocaine at a party hosted by Normal. Based on these events and strong resistance from conservatives, Carter's efforts never actually gained any ground. Where Carter's administration did not push for any more stringent laws targeting drug use or possession in this country, the first Reagan administration hit the ground running to continue in Nixon's footsteps. First Lady Nancy Reagan also helped support her husband's efforts to further criminalize drug use by campaigning on her own. In 1984, Mrs. Reagan used the term "just say no" at an elementary school in California. When a young girl asked what she should do if offered drugs, Nancy replied, "just say no." Mrs. Reagan ran a national anti-drug campaign that used celebrity endorsements, collaboration from the newly formed DARE program, and included visits to the United Nations, drug rehabilitation centers, morning talk shows, and recorded public service announcements, and more. The message was clear. Drug use was absolutely forbidden, and the promotion of an abstinence model went countrywide. As I mentioned before, the collaboration with DARE allowed the anti-drug message to reach students in the classroom by promoting the prevention of drug use, gang membership, and other violent behaviors. For those of you who might be a little too young for DARE, the program consisted of police officers who would make visits to school classrooms where they warned children that drugs were harmful and should be refused. DARE sought to educate children on how to resist peer pressure and how to refuse drugs. It also condemned alcohol, tobacco, graffiti, and tattoos as the result of peer pressure. However, the message was being promoted was one of hellfire and brimstone in some ways. Instead of educating students about the realities of drug use, they promoted a fearful message which told children that they would die from using the drugs or go to prison from the drugs. They might be automatically caught with the drugs and more. But as we know, when you tell young people don't do something through a fearful lens, they want to do it that much more. Academic research focused on the efficacy of DARE found counterintuitive results to the program. Instead of lowering drug use rates among young people who went through the program, DARE was shown to have no effect on use rates. Some research even suggests that those who went through DARE have higher rates of drug use than those who did not attend the program. Although Mrs. Reagan had good intent, her efforts seem to have gone the way of her husband's when considering the totality of success for the war on drugs. 2 years after Nancy's proclamation to just say no, President Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 into law. This single law had decades of impact after its creation that we are still feeling even today. This was the big daddy of them all. With the passage of the ADAA, federal mandatory minimums were put into place for drug users. For those of you who might be a little unsure about mandatory minimums, this type of sentencing program required that convicted defendants be incarcerated for a statutory defined period of time, and they would be required to serve 85% or more of their sentence. Also included in this law was the elimination of federal parole programs. So now anyone convicted after October 1986 would be ineligible to be released early on parole, hence the 85% of the sentence. In addition to the elimination of parole, the ADAA provided more than $1 billion to fund the drug war and increased the number of drug offenses that could be prosecuted federally. As you may remember from earlier lectures, this was the law that created the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. So this is where we are seeing equal sentences being given to those with 100 grams of powder cocaine compared to the 1 gram of crack cocaine. This law specifically implemented a 5-year mandatory minimum sentence for those in possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine, whereas a powder user would need to be found with at least 500 grams of powder to be given the same 5-year sentence. As we discussed in our stimulants lecture, this law was enacted shortly after the death of Len Bias, the basketball star who overdosed on crack cocaine. The implementation of this law had large-reaching efforts into the Black community, where a disproportionate amount of Black defendants were being sentenced at a higher rate and for a longer sentence compared to white defendants. The law led to an increase in the average time in prison for drug crimes from 22 months to 33 months. After the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, the number of Black people sent to federal prison skyrocketed from an approximate 50 in 100,000 adults to approximately 250 in every 100,000 adults. During that same period of mass increase in Black prison rates, there was almost no change in the number of white people incarcerated in federal prison. On average, Black defendants were subjected to prison sentences that were 49% longer than for those of the white defendants. It was estimated that by 2014, more than half of the inmates serving federal prison sentences were there for either drug-related charges branching from the ADAA. This law, more than any other, had significant, long-lasting impacts to the incarceration rate in this country that we are still trying to dismantle. President George H.W. Bush served as Reagan's vice president and continued his former boss's efforts when he took over the White House. While the Bush administration did not pass many landmark bills regarding drug prosecution in the U.S., nothing was done to alleviate prior efforts. Bush significantly increased the budget for federal drug control efforts after publicly holding up a bag of crack cocaine on national TV after a publicity stunt occurred with the arrest of an 18-year-old D.C. resident named Keith Jackson outside the White House. In retrospect, we now know that the DEA lured Jackson to the arrest location and even gave him directions to where they would eventually entrap him. Jackson's case was thrown out by 2 different juries for entrapment, but eventually he was sentenced to 10 years for selling to an undercover agent. This publicity stunt was widely mocked and criticized, but in the end, Bush did not really receive much blowback and was able to push more resources toward the prosecution of drug offenses. Bush did create a program called Smoke a Joint, Lose Your License, where drivers would lose their driver's license for 6 months, even if they weren't driving during their drug offenses. Although states were threatened with funding cuts if they did not comply with the program, hardly any states got on board with this plan. At its peak, 19 states had these laws in place, but many have gone back to opting out of the program. As of this recording, only Alabama, Arkansas, and Florida continue to participate in the program. Additionally, Bush is also credited with shutting down a Carter-era program called the Compassionate Investigational New Drug Program, which provided federally produced marijuana to AIDS patients on a limited basis. The former director of the program was quoted with saying that he was not surprised by the shutdown and that, quote, if it is perceived that the Public Health Service is going around giving marijuana to folks, there would also be a perception that this stuff can't be so bad. During a 1994 interview, President Nixon's domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman, provided inside information suggesting that the War on Drugs campaign had ulterior motives, which many involved helped Nixon keep his job. Speaking with journalist Dan Brom, Ehrlichman commented that beginning with the 1968 Nixon campaign and carrying through to the actual administration, Nixon felt targeted by two groups in particular. Ehrlichman is quoted as saying, quote, "You want to know what this war on drugs was really about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You know what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." End quote. Ehrlichman served as a policy advisor for Nixon during the campaign and his presidency. He was one of the advisors who was also involved in the Watergate scandal and ended up serving 18 months in prison after being convicted of conspiracy and perjury for his role in the events that toppled his boss. Many people believe that Nixon's policies were politically targeting specific groups, but felt as though Ehrlichman's quote gave concrete proof to that belief. Also that year, President Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 into law, which to date serves as the most expansive crime bill in modern history. While this act was not exclusively a drug law, it had far-reaching impacts into the war on drugs and continued to exacerbate it with its continued expansion of prison construction, funding for new police officers, and an expansion of federal efforts related to the death penalty, restrictions on firearms for convicted persons, and more. During the 1992 campaign, Clinton was criticized as being soft on crime, specifically for drug offenses, when reports surfaced that Clinton himself had used marijuana in the past, even if he didn't inhale. The passage of the 1994 Act proved that Clinton was not being soft on crime and that he would be essential to lowering the crime rates across the U.S. for all types of offenses. While it was true that crime rates dropped, incarceration rates and sentencing lengths continued to increase as a result of the crime bill. There were funding incentives for states to get on board with the truth in sentencing measures promoted within the crime bill. 28 states plus D.C. jumped on board with the proposal and expanded their own mandatory minimum sentencing provisions. Between 1994 and 1999, the Bureau of Justice Statistics estimated that the prison populations increased by 57% during that time, even though we only saw a 17% increase in the number of people sentenced per year. This indicates that folks are being sentenced for longer sentences and are having to serve nearly all of those sentences. Three strikes initiatives began to become popular as well during this time, which required life sentences to defendants who were on their third strike. So when you have an increase in sentence length, an elimination of parole, and the expansion of felony crimes all converge, you end up with a significant overcrowding issue for these incarcerated individuals. Since leaving office, Bill Clinton has expressed a strong regret for the expansions included in this bill that work toward increasing the incarceration populations in this country. But we are still using mandatory minimum sentences and truth in sentencing structures today as the result of the passage of the 1994 crime bill. Although George W. Bush's administration will forever be tied to 9/11 and the war on terror, he also played a role in the continuation of the war on drugs. During the Clinton administration and subsequent Bush administrations, we see the legalization of marijuana, medical marijuana, popping up at the state level. Bush used every federal resource at his disposal to enforce federal law when it came to marijuana use, and was supported by 2 different Supreme Court cases which backed up his efforts. In 2001, the Supreme Court upheld the broad application of the Controlled Substances Act in U.S. v. Oakland Cannabis Buyers Corporation, ruling that medical need does not create an exception to federal marijuana prohibition. Later in 2005's Gonzalez v. Raich, the court affirmed the federal government's power to enforce that prohibition, even in states that had legalized medical marijuana. Basically, these 2 cases gave Bush the power to raid dispensaries, and there was nothing that the states could do. Even if the dispensary was licensed by the state and paid taxes on the sale of marijuana, federal agents were allowed to raid these dispensaries, confiscate the marijuana, and arrest those running the businesses. From 2001 to 2003, the federal government raided over 100 state legal medical marijuana growers and dispensaries. In 2006 alone, DEA agents arrested 594 people on marijuana charges in California, which had voted to legalize medical marijuana a decade earlier. Business owners in full compliance with state laws saw their assets seized, and even if they were acquitted of all charges, any marijuana-related property confiscated by law enforcement was not returned. One estimate indicates that through the Bush era, 163 federal criminal cases were brought against individuals either using medical marijuana or who were involved in medical marijuana businesses in states where doing so was legal. With President Obama's election in 2008, many thought that the progressive candidate would finally be the one who would work to reverse the efforts of the war on drugs. In his first administration, President Obama did tackle a few items to help reverse the efforts of previous administrations. His platform was designed to be tough but smart in regard to drug policies, and believed that drug use and addiction was very much a public health crisis that needed to be tackled by more than just the criminal justice system. In 2010, Obama signed the Fair Sentencing Act, which we have already discussed once this semester. If you recall, this was the law that lowered the crack and powder cocaine sentencing ratio from 100-1 to 18-1, meaning that 1 ounce of powder cocaine would now be equivalent to 18 grams of crack cocaine. The original version of this bill, as it was introduced into the Senate, completely eliminated all disparities and would have sentenced both drugs at a 1-to-1 ratio. However, after objections from the Republican-led Senate Judiciary Committee, the bill was updated to the approved 18-to-1 ratio. In the law itself, there is recognition that the beliefs regarding how much more addictive crack cocaine was compared to powder cocaine are both outdated and false. This change received bipartisan support and was even heralded as much needed change by President Obama's predecessor, President Bush. During his tenure as president, Obama stated that his goal was to treat marijuana as, quote, a public health issue, the same way we do with cigarettes or alcohol, end quote, but not as a criminal justice issue. In 2016, President Obama began pardoning and shortening the sentence length of hundreds of federal inmates who were convicted for marijuana-based crimes. Additionally, that year, he allocated $1 billion to be spent over the next 2 years to combat the growing crisis surrounding opioid prescriptions and the heroin epidemic. However, the money being allocated towards public health initiatives and agencies without a single dime going to CJ-driven programs. Furthermore, the administration acknowledged publicly that you cannot arrest and incarcerate the addiction out of people. While Obama was not willing to go as far as to decriminalize marijuana or work towards legalization, he continued to pardon low-level, nonviolent drug offenders up until the end of his second term. Additionally, in 2009, only 2 months into his first term, Attorney General Eric Holder announced that the DEA would no longer be conducting raids on state-approved marijuana dispensaries. President Obama believed that the states were authorized to allow the controlled use of medical marijuana and that it was no different than any other pain medications in that regard. While he stopped short of supporting recreational marijuana, we know that states did begin the process of legalization during his presidency. But even then, the DEA did not resume its raids on these dispensaries. During the 2016 presidential campaign, Donald Trump campaigned on putting an end to the opioid crisis in the U.S. and highlighted some of the more significant statistics related to overdose, death, prenatal use of opioids, and more. While this was a big promise, and he did make efforts to curtail opioid use, we know that the crisis was not finally ended. It has become so out of control that it will most likely take several more years to begin reining it in. In 2017, President Trump formally declared the opioid crisis as a public health crisis and signed the Support for Patients and Communities Act a year later. This act received overwhelming bipartisan support and directed agencies to make drug treatment a priority for those affected by opioid use. Additionally, the law cracked down on overprescription efforts and worked to intercept shipments of synthetic opioids like fentanyl coming in from overseas. The law also allowed for expanded use of naloxone, which allowed for opioid overdose to be reversed through the administration of the antidote drug. With President Trump's election, there were many concerns that his administration would work to reverse the efforts of his predecessor, President Obama, in regards to marijuana reform. Specifically, with the appointment of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, there were concerns that the DEA would begin raiding dispensaries in the states that allowed for medicinal and recreational marijuana use. Sessions shocked many people with his statements that, quote, good people don't smoke marijuana, and that marijuana is, quote, only slightly less awful than heroin. With the Obama-era provisions regarding the raids ending in September 2016, many believed the raids would start near immediately, but that didn't end up happening. Instead, President Trump turned a somewhat blind eye to the law's end, even though there was nothing stopping him from using the full extent of federal law to put the states back in check. However, with the growing popularity of marijuana legalization in most states, the raids were viewed very negatively, and advisors believed that it would backfire on President Trump. Attorney General Jeff Sessions was fired in 2018 and was replaced with Bill Barr in early 2019. While not being totally pro-legalization, Barr was known to be sympathetic toward legalization and vowed that he would not go after the states who enacted legalization, stating instead that this is a states' rights issue and that he would like to see legislation be put in place where states would be free to make that determination for themselves. With the 2020 election of President Joe Biden, many people believe that he would follow in President Obama's footsteps to help make progressive changes to the current drug policies. However, before we get into his current efforts, we cannot forget that when he was still a senator, Biden was one of the most strong advocates for the war on drugs and helped to craft both the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. These two seminal pieces were largely influential to the continuation of the war on drugs and helped to significantly increase the prison populations at both the state and federal level. Remember that the 1986 ADAA bill was the one to establish the 100-to-1 sentencing ratio for crack and powder cocaine and introduced mandatory minimum sentencing structures. During his time as a senator, he was so adamantly anti-drug that he earned the nickname Drug War Joe. His efforts at being tough on crime have had significantly long-lasting impacts, but many thought that his time as vice president to a progressive Democratic president worked to cool his fervor for incarceration and harsh penalties as they related to drug offenders. In October 2022, he took a much different approach to marijuana offenders. President Biden pardoned thousands of people convicted of federal marijuana possession. However, his pardons only extended to those in possession and did not extend to those convicted of distribution or selling weed. In December of the same year, Biden signed the Medical Marijuana and Cannabinoid Research Expansion Act into law. The new law requires the DEA to register researchers and suppliers of cannabis for medical research in a timely manner, who will then be able to legally manufacture, distribute, dispense, and possess the substance. The law also creates a way for FDA approval of drugs derived from the cannabis plant and, quote, protects doctors who may now discuss the harms and benefits of using cannabis and cannabis derivatives. It also requires the Department of Health and Human Services to investigate the medical utility of cannabis and barriers that exist to conducting research. And it requires the Attorney General to conduct an annual review to ensure that cannabis is being adequately produced for research purposes. This was an important step as previous administrations limited the research that was permitted on cannabis. In order to reschedule the drug out of Schedule I status, the Biden administration felt that we needed more information regarding the medical properties of the drug. While critics felt as though we already know a lot about the drug, this was an initial step forward to federal legalization. Biden has also stated that he is not ready to make marijuana legal at the federal level, but supporters of legalization believe he is waiting for a second term to take that step. This is going to conclude our first micro lecture of the module focused on the war on drugs. I know this was a bit lengthier as we normally go, but I think it is important to examine the different policies derived from each presidential administration. No one has worked to totally eliminate these harmful drug policies, but we are working toward more progressive reform with each new administration. Join me back here next time when we look more closely at the long-term effects of these drug policies and the lasting impact to the correctional system and incarceration rates from these efforts. I'll see you here next time.